shook her down.
Heave away, haul away.
I shook her all about the town.
We're bound for South Australia.
Heave away, you rolling kings, as you heave away, haul away. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South.
Well, afternoon everyone, the Kremlin's Geordie master spy. I've been following this story for many years, and this is my attempt to tie it into, Whitley Bay and Cullercoats, the northeast coast. Steven Spielberg's film, 2015, Bridge of Spies, which I'm sure lots of you have seen, tells the story of the arrest of a Soviet spy in New York in 1957, and then goes on to his trial and conviction, his 30-year prison sentence, and how he was exchanged in 1962 for an American pilot called Gary Powers, which I think we've probably all heard of, who'd been shot down over the Soviet Union in something called the U-2 incident of 1960. Here's a photo of the Soviet spy in question. Much later, obviously, after his death, this is Rudolf Abel, immortalised on a Soviet, very late Soviet 5-kopeck stamp, 1990. At the time of his arrest, no one in the West knew who the spy really was. The Americans knew only that he said his name was Rudolf Abel. They arrested him because he'd been shopped by a Soviet defector, and when they got into his apartment, they found he got radio equipment there, which incidentally will crop up again at the end. Otherwise, apart from the defector and the radio equipment, they didn't have a lot on him. They could tell that he spoke English with a peculiar accent, not American, but native. Still, they never worked out exactly where it came from. And of course, those were the days before people's voices commonly made it into the public domain. So the prosecutors didn't get a lot of help from the general public. After Abel was exchanged for Gary Powers on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin in 1962, his bosses in Moscow, spymaster bosses, made a lot of him. But they didn't reveal his true identity. All they wanted to do was glorify the Soviet intelligence services. So they mythologized him under that name. This was the hero who had defeated the Americans by not telling them anything. They sent him round Soviet schools to inspire youngsters. I actually met a lady many decades later who had been in school when he visited. They permitted Abel to write short stories, some of which exist and can be read. They got him to introduce a film about spying called The Dead Season, which is about a different Soviet spy. But they didn't let the public into his real life. So when the American journalist Louise Bernicau published a book about him in 1970, which for many years was the main book about him, she still didn't know the name he was born under. After the Soviet authorities announced his death towards the end of 1971, his dates are on the stamp, the obituary that followed up this announcement in the London Times declared, and I'm quoting, "The man known as Colonel Rudolf Abel remains today an almost total enigma." This is 1971. Light began to dawn the next year, 1972, when, and now I'm quoting the New York Times, some Western newsmen stumbled upon his grave marker in a Moscow cemetery. Apart from the spy's cover name, the grave marker gave his real name, William August Fisher, his date of birth, 11th of July, 1903, again that's on the stamp, the names and dates of his father and a few other family members. This was a family grave. From the point of view of research workers, people like me, the father's name, Henry Matthew Fisher, was particularly important because he was a known personage, not famous, but he was known to scholars. It could be established from published sources that he'd spent the first 2 decades of the 20th century in northeast England. So it became clear, therefore, look at that birth date again, 1903, that the spy, Abel Fisher, must have been born and brought up somewhere not far from where we are now, northeast England. Nevertheless, no one really picked up the ball and ran with it until a Russian emigre, Kirill Henkin, who had been friends, as it turned out, with Abel Fisher, as I must now call him by both names. Henkin published a Russian language book about Abel Fisher in Frankfurt in 1980. Pretty obscure book, think about it. It's in the Russian language, it's published in Frankfurt. It's not going to be released in the Soviet Union, and not many people in the West are going to read it either because it's in Russian. Still, the American scholar Walter Laqueur, a famous specialist on Soviet foreign policy intelligence matters, reviewed the book in the London Times Literary Supplement. And he spelled out that, according to Henkin, Abel Fisher had been born at 140 Clara Street in the Newcastle district of Benwell on, as the grave marker had already told us, 11th of July 1903. I was astonished. I was a young lecturer at the time, and reading the Times Literary Supplement, that's the sort of thing lecturers do. 140 Clara Street isn't there anymore. The Fisher's house was in this bit of the road, the extremely steep lower part of the road. The road used to run right down to the River Tyne. It was one of the steepest streets in Newcastle. But what survives of the road, which is the upper part, gives a general idea of the place where Abel was born. He was born in one of the endless terrace streets which Newcastle is full of. So here then I'm standing at the same place when I took these 2 photographs. I just turned round and photographed up and then photographed down first and then up. So that's where he came from, Benwell, the west side of Newcastle, between Elsey and Scotswood, I suppose. To check, but I had to check what Henkin claimed in this Frankfurt book of 1980 about Abel Fisher's place and date of birth, I applied, this is in 1983, to Newcastle Civic Centre for a copy of the birth certificate. I had all the information I needed. I've got a full name, I certainly got father's name, I got date and place of birth. And back came a copy by return of post. You could have knocked me down with a feather. This is 1983, 1984. I had to accept that Rudolf Abel, or Willie Fisher, was a Geordie by birth. How on earth, I asked myself, did he get from being born in Clara Street in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1903 to being arrested as a Soviet spy in New York in 1957? To answer that question, I have to say more about his background and upbringing. So now we're going backwards in time, before 1903. Willie's father, I'll also be calling him Willie Fisher, Rudolf Abel. Willie's father, Henry Matthew Fisher, sounds English, but he wasn't English. He was ethnically German. His real name was Heinrich Matthäus Fischer, Fisher with a C in the middle. But despite being German, he wasn't born in Germany. He was born in the province of Yaroslavl in north-central Russia in 1871, and I can prove this. I'm not going to show you, but I got his birth certificate too. Heinrich Matthäus's father was from the Principality of Sachsen-Altenburg in Germany, but he had been brought into Russia by a Russian prince to work as the manager of the prince's, or one of the prince's estates. So Russian princes often did this in the 19th century. If you read your Anna Karenina there, you'll find jokes about German estate managers. So the spy's grandfather, is brought into Russia. His father, Heinrich Matthäus, goes to school in Russia. So he becomes, Russian at school, German at home, in the same way that the spy later became English at school, Russian at home. Heinrich Matthäus went to school in the Russian provinces, and at the end of his school days, in his teens, we're now in the late 1880s, Henry Matthew got an apprenticeship at a German-run metalworking factory in St. Petersburg. And there, in the Russian capital, Heinrich Matthäus became an active member of pretty well the first politically conscious generation of the Russian working class. And people like me have spent ages trying to work out when Russian workers were politicised before the Russian Revolution of 1917. Heinrich Matthäus certainly was radicalised, politicised to an extreme. He knew Lenin, who was almost his exact contemporary, on a one-to-one basis as early as 1893-94. Of course, this got him into trouble. Dedicated to the cause of revolution, an activist, he went through a predictable Tsarist cycle: arrest, imprisonment, internal exile. Not Siberia, they sent him to the far north, to the Archangel area up by the Arctic. Eventually, he got out of internal exile. He met his wife shortly after that on the Volga. They'd sent him to a provincial town called Saratov. But he continued his activism there, and in 1901 the Tsarist authorities finally got fed up with him and forced him out of Russia. They told him that although you've been born in Russia, you're not Russian. You're a citizen of the German Empire, which was technically true, I think. He'd certainly never taken out Russian citizenship. So they were within their rights, and you could argue even that they're trying to spare him Siberia. Anyway, they said to him, either you leave or we're going to do even worse things to you. So it's 1901. He's a trained metal worker. Remember that apprenticeship? It's not at all surprising that, compelled to leave Russia, he decided to go to Newcastle. At that time, Newcastle upon Tyne was one of the top places in the world for metal workers. Also, as it happens, Heinrich Matthäus had a Russian friend who had been to Newcastle already, and they came together. In fact, there are three of them. Heinrich Matthäus, his wife, the lady he met in Saratov, and this chap, Alexander Khazietsky, who passes out of the story because he got ill almost as soon as they got to Newcastle. He's buried in Elsick Cemetery. By the end of 1901, Heinrich Matthäus had been taken on at Armstrong's of Elsick, the most famous industrial enterprise on Tyneside. Between then, 1901 and 1908, he lived at various addresses in the Newcastle suburb of Benwell. This is the bit we've already dealt with in part, including Clare Street, where Willie was born. But in 1908, Fisher Sr., Heinrich Matthäus and his wife, and by now 2 children, moved from Benwell a few miles east to the North Sea coast, where we are now. Between 1909 and 1913, the family lived here. This is my photograph taken last year, I think. 24 Eleanor Street, it's the blue one, 24 Eleanor Street, Cullercoats, so just a few hundred yards from where we are now. They lived there for 4 years, and then after Eleanor Street, between 1913 and 1921, they rented various houses in Lish Avenue. There's Lish Avenue, which is also very much within striking distance. In fact, I think it's probably nearer striking distance of where we are now. I can't give you a specific one. It would be pettifogging to give you their various addresses in Lish Avenue because they moved around. They're renting all the time, so it depends on the charges, the rent. Throughout the 20 years that the Fishers spent in northeast England, 1921, the head of the household, Heinrich Matthäus, remained strongly committed to the socialist convictions he'd adopted in Russia in the 1890s. I'm going to spare you the details of the father's local political activities, but they were legion. You know, he worked for his trade union, Amalgamated Society of Engineers. He was an activist in local government elections and national elections, always for extreme radicals. He canvassed the crews of Russian sailors who came to the Tyne to because of ships built here which needed Russian crews to take them back to Russia. Suffice it to say that Heinrich Matthäus Fischer, the Spies' father, will undoubtedly have brought up both his sons to be left-wingers. I don't believe it would have been possible to be a teenager in this family without having a strong sense of what your father believed. The family looked highly conventional. Here's a photo taken in Whitley Bay in 1916. The future Rudolf Abel is on the left, his brother Henry is on the right, Heinrich again, mother Lyubov, Zhilova, her maiden name, bottom left, and Heinrich Matthäus on the right. I owe this photograph to Vin Arthey, the principal specialist on Abel's spying activities, who got it from Evelina Fischer, Rudolf Abel's daughter, late daughter. She gave Vin permission to use this photograph. It appears in his book, Abel, which came out in 2015. And Vin has said he sees no reason why I shouldn't use it too. They look very conventional. They're in their Sunday best. But it's my claim, I'm sure I'm right about this, that behind the facade of the Sunday best, they were radicals. The young Willie Fisher, the tall guy on the left, went to secondary school here on the northeast coast at what at the time was called Whitley Bay and Monkseaton High School. It's building's still there. It's now Marden Middle School. And later, after finishing school, which he will have done at age 14, I would think, he attended Rutherford College in Newcastle, a forerunner of what is now the University of Northumbria. He got the higher school certificate, so if there had been any money, he could have gone on to a university course too. He was obviously clever. He also showed artistic talent. There's no doubt about this, and I'm going to say a bit about it, and it is important in his life. If you have seen Spielberg's film Bridge of Spies, you'll remember that in the opening scene, I think, Rudolf Abel is painting in Manhattan down by the river, or one of the riverfronts. And that is not made up. I mean, that was his colour. I'm going to speculate now that he may have been inspired when he was on the northeast coast by the Cullercoats outdoor painter, John Falconer Slater, who has a plaque in St Oswin's Avenue in Cullercoats. And more to the point, he was a very near neighbour of the Fisher family. I've been checking his addresses in local address books, sort of thing historians do, when Willie was growing up. He lived in the Esplanade, Whitley Bay. He lived in Lish Avenue itself at one point, although I'm not sure when the Fishers were still there. In 1920, Slater founded something called the Northeast Coast or Northeast Art Club. My speculation is that maybe Willie Fisher, who was a teenager in 1920, 16, 17, was one of the first members of Slater's club. The thing about this is Slater painted outdoors. He wore that other great northeast invention, the barber, and he painted in all weathers. You know, it's quite cold today. If you were down on the seafront, you probably wouldn't like it very much, but Slater would have gone on painting in this. And you're a teenager, you're interested in art, and you see this guy and you go and see what he's doing. Or even you meet him in your street, if indeed they coincided in Lish Avenue. We're never going to know if Willie Fisher knew Slater, but whether he did or not, his artistic talent certainly helped him to get his first job. This we do know. His first job was as a draftsman at the Tyneside shipbuilders Swan Hunter. And when, a bit of evidence coming up now, when long after Willie's death, Moscow published a volume of his drawings and paintings under the name Abel, the first reproduction in that volume, which came out in 2000, I think, was of a drawing. It's the only English drawing in the book, a drawing entitled In the North of England, which is here. And it's a bit hard to see, but it's signed in the bottom right-hand corner in both English and Russian. And it's dated, oh joy. Historians like dates, 1920. So it's dated when they're still here. Willie is, well, he's 17 in July 1920. It's signed in, both alphabets, and it reminded, when I showed this picture to Alicia Ward of the watch house at Cullercoats, she said, oh, it looks just like that little house down Pier Road. If you go down, I rushed off down Pier Road immediately. I'll be there before. I never noticed this house, but if you go down Pier Road to the right of the Tynemouth Priory, and you're going, as it were, to the Collingwood Memorial or to the car park down there, what you see is this. A little tumble-down house. It's less than, well, I suppose, about a mile from where we are now, not much more. And this just made this comparison unprompted. I might have said to her, I wish I knew where he'd done this, but it seems to me that she's right, that they're very close. I can see differences, but we've got to allow for 100 years passing. To me, it's a slam dunk that Willie is there. I mean, they weren't rich, his family. They didn't have cars. He hadn't driven out into the countryside. I mean, who had cars in 1920? Private citizens. It'd be somewhere near where he lived. And he's on the bank below Tynemouth Priory looking at this house, making a drawing. It seems to me clear. Anyway, whatever he based his drawing on, the result must have meant a lot to him, because this drawing is in Moscow now. They, after all, published it in 2000. That means Willie Fisher held on to his drawing for the rest of his life. He packed it and took it with the family to Russia in 1921. I assume he kept it to remind himself of where he grew up. For a year after he signed and dated this drawing, Heinrich Matthäus, his father, ever the committed socialist, took all the family from Cullercoats Bay, Whitley Bay, to live in newly communist Russia. Now, the boys, Willie and Henry, had never been in Russia. Their parents were both from there. The Russian Revolution had happened 4 years before, 1917. Bit of hard-hat history here. There were then years of civil war in Russia, and it was only by very late 1920 or early 1921 that Russia looked like the sort of place you could go to. Westerners started visiting. And Heinrich Matthias, who of course was extreme radical, was delighted to be able to go home, which is what it was for him, and to a home which now he surely hoped embodied what he'd been fighting for all his life, 1921. He's a returnee. So the family's all in Russia, 1921. Willie is 17, 18. What does he do? Well, he goes to college, the same as he perhaps would have done here if there'd been. Anyway, he did go briefly to Rutherford College. He went on studying languages, I think Oriental languages, for a year or two. He didn't complete the course. He then had to do military service. And in the course of his military service, we're still in the early 1920s, he learned radio telegraphy. And here we come to my second speculation. It's easy to imagine that, like painting, Willie Fisher's interest in radio also began here in northeast England, because one of England's first ever radio masts went into operation next door to the Cullercoats watch house at the very time the Fishers moved to the area. My understanding is that it began its continuous life in 1908, if that's true. That's the very year they moved to the coast. Here's a photograph of Cullercoats Bay. This is not my photograph, this is Roy McCallum's photograph. It says copyright Roy McCallum, bottom left-hand corner. I just found it on the internet. But Roy McCallum worked at Cullercoats radio station, which closed in 1998. And you can hear him talking about it on the BBC 3-minute interview over the web. Right in the middle of this photograph, Roy's photograph, you can, and in the far distance, you ought to be able to make out radio masts. They're not there anymore. 2024, they've gone, but they were there throughout Willie Fisher's childhood. Indeed, they went up. They will have been a talking point in his childhood. So he must surely have taken note, and he, for all I know, was fascinated to the point where, when he's doing military service in Russia in the early 1920s, and radio telegraphy becomes an option, he says, okay, well, I'll go for that then. So, by the mid-1920s, Willie Fisher's combination of skills made him pretty well perfect spying material. He was young, 21 in 1924. He was at least bilingual, English and Russian. He may have been trilingual if his father also taught him German, because his father's first language, or home language, had been German. He may indeed have been multilingual, because he'd studied Oriental languages, I've read, in college in Russia. So he knows languages. He's a trained radio operator. And he's a good enough artist to make painting the basis of a possible cover story if his bosses ever wanted him to live illegally in a foreign country. I think on the basis of these things, we can safely assume that when the Soviet intelligence services checked him out in 1927 to see if he was suitable for recruitment, it was put to him by a relative that he might apply. They will have concluded he was just the sort of person they were looking for. I should add that his father's still living and is a very highly respected person in the young Soviet Union, was factory manager by this time. A friend of Lenin, actually wrote about his friendship with Lenin in a mag in 1930. So Willie was recruited in 1927 and embarked on what became a 30-year career as a spy. The career which is sort of, owing to Vin's book, above all, whose active part was to end in exposure and imprisonment in the United States exactly 3 decades later, 1957. We know the broad outline of those 30 years is more or less clear. It's thought he may have been in China as early as the late 20s. He was certainly in Oslo, 1931 to 5. He was briefly in Britain, 1935-6. I'd love to know more about this. Did he ever revisit the place he'd come from? He then taught spies in a school in Moscow. He left the Spies in the very difficult years of the High Purges at the end of the 30s. He was brought back in the war and played a part in deception of the German armed forces. And then in 1949, he was sent via Canada to the USA, where he's presumably doing stuff in connection with keeping the spy show on the road there after the Americans had exposed the atom spies at the end of the 40s and early 50s. But that isn't really my subject. The 30 years of Willie's active life as a spy. I've said a bit about his life after he came back to Russia in the 60s. He died incidentally of lung cancer, so keen smoker. What I've been trying to get across is that his career owed a very great deal, more possibly than scholars have made clear so far, to the time Willie Fisher spent as a child and teenager in a strongly committed socialist family within a few hundred yards of where we are now, especially within the watch house at Cullercoats, which incidentally also appears on this last photograph on the extreme left. Thank you.
I shook her up, I shook her down,
Heave away, haul away.
I shook her all about the town.
We're bound for South Australia.